everyone. Welcome to another episode of Leaders Podcast. Leaders Podcast gives me the opportunity to speak to some of the most influential and experienced leaders in the investigation and intelligence space. Today, I'm joined by a good friend, a colleague, a guy I've got huge respect for, Roger Bescoby, Director of Client Relations here at Conflict, and he's also got Senior Vice President position at the World Association of Detectives. Really excited to speak to you today, Rog. Just quickly introduce yourself, tell everyone who's listening who you are, a bit of your background, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and hello, everybody. Very honoured to be asked to do this podcast, to be honest. Not something I've done before, but as you know, I'm a very shy and retiring individual, but I shall do my best. Well, as Mike has said, I'm currently sitting here as Director of Client Relations at Conflict International, into our 11th year together now. Two of them happy, I think. No, that's not true. We've had a fantastic relationship, and I can honestly say it's been probably the happiest period of my working life. And I'm not just saying that because the boss is here. Genuinely, I've been thoroughly enjoying my world here with Conflict. But you know, when I actually look back at my journey, and particularly to where I am on the WAD thing, I will come back to that later. Pretty amazing, really, the numbers of changes that I've had to make along the way with the business, with my business life. So.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, looking forward to unpicking this, Rog. So, how did you get into the industry and when?
Right. Well, it's a really good point. I left school when I was 17, and before that, I was working in our sort of fourth generation family business. My dad and his father before him had a retail credit business in Salford, and that business actually in its day was quite innovative because you could go in and get some goods and pay later, which before the days of credit cards and what have you. And the system worked basically on people having an account. You'd come in, they'd buy some goods. It was mainly clothing. My grandfather was a tailor. He used to make suits off, had seamstresses working upstairs doing that sort of stuff, and shoes and things like that. And I joined that business, but then also went to college at the same time to do business studies. And around about then, the shop that we were in, this will be now 73, 74. The shop that we were in was getting compulsory purchased, and my dad, I could see, was stressed to hell about all the upheaval of moving that and where's he going to go and one thing and another. And it sort of brought me to come back in and work in the business full time. So that's what I did. I joined the business, and I sort of got involved in changing the business from a very, very traditional, bit like Grace Brothers, really, if you're honest, those sort of counters and that sort of shop, into doing fashion. We had an account with Adidas and Farah trousers and people like that. Got it more trendy, and that's So I've never really been frightened of sort of making changes to keep up with the times, really. That business, we had a really nice shop, then a new shop in Salford. And trading became difficult down there, ram raids, break-ins, one thing and another. And also the credit business that we had customers that, surprisingly enough, didn't want to pay you. They'd have the goods and then disappear. So normally, you'd go along and say, I'll come for the next 30 weeks for £2 a week to pay for your suit or whatever it was. And then you go on the third week and they've gone. Oh. And those sort of things. And at that sort of end of the credit spectrum, it was quite common. And so I didn't realise, Mike, at the time that was really my sort of grounding in doorstep work, and finding people, because nothing turns you into a better investigator than going after your own money. It's not a case that this wasn't somebody else's money, this was our money. And so, it was second nature to me to go and knock on the doors of neighbours, go to the corner shop, talk to the postman, do whatever I could to try and find this person who owed me a lot of money at the time. So I didn't know at the time that was my grounding for what my business became afterwards, but it was just second nature really to go and do that. And then in about 81, I got married, moved out to South Manchester, and I ended up living very close to two medical consultants, just who I met through neighbours and what have you. And these guys, back in the day, Bupa and the like, used to pay the patient after an operation. So they'd send the patient a cheque for 7,000 quid and say, go and pay Mr. Jones 2 grand and pay the hospital 5 grand. And of course, some people didn't. They actually thought that cheque landed just before Christmas, and they thought, oh, happy days. So I mean, nowadays those insurance companies pay the subjects directly. They pay the suppliers directly. But anyway, so I got chatting to these guys, and I said, well, go and knock on the door, ask for them. Oh, nobody does that. I said, well, I'll do it. I knock on doors for a living. That's what I do. I'll wear a shirt and a tie and a briefcase. And I found myself going out there knocking on doors to people who'd never had a doorstep collection in their life, didn't expect it. And I did really, really well, just charging a commission on those debts. And then I also found that a lot of people, probably half of them, didn't even live at the address that they were sending the bill to. They'd moved.
Right.
So I then go and speak to neighbours again, second nature, and then I realised, I should be charging for this. Really, you owe 5 grand. I'll find the person, and then so I then started putting a little charge. I think it's like 40 quid just to do a trace. It was ridiculous at the time.
Yeah.
And I then wanted to become better at tracing because and the debt collection I thought was being the future. And then Bupa started paying the suppliers direct, so that sort of went down the pan. But by that time, I'd picked up some other debt collection businesses from builders, merchants, all sorts of different things. And I wanted to get better at tracing. So I joined the ABI. That was my reason for sort of getting better connected into finding out how you do this. That was really the next stage.
It's a real grassroots investigating from the ground up, right?
Yeah, but completely second nature. It didn't bother me at all to knock on a door and go and find somebody. And I can remember going to some of the ABI meetings, and there were some guys turning up there in very nice motors and obviously doing very, very well at what they do. And I'm saying, well, what does he do? He said, oh, those lads there, they're all into personal injury surveillance. I said, oh, really? Tell me about that. Well, they do the filming and they do the whatever. And my ears pricked up, really, because there's nothing I like more than sort of catching a fraudster. I was passionate then, and I'm passionate to this very day, getting a result for a client and wanting to do that. So I thought, I'm going to look into that. And I had a few mates at that time who were lawyers in the personal injury space, in the defendant personal injury space. And it's a long story short, but I went and bought a little Fiat van, put some silver foil on the back, borrowed my mother's camcorder, and went out and did a few videos, and that was how it started. And that really was the passion, and that grew and grew into something that to this day I've got a big passion for. And I know yourself and John Fawcett at Donflick, we are kindred spirits when it comes to surveillance and the value that it can give. So yeah, that's really how. But it's quite often that people say, they just presume as a PI, you must have started as a police officer or in the forces or whatever. No, streets of Salford.
Streets of Salford. There you go. To world positions in a global association. So so back then, Rog, it was a case of no real privacy legislation. Let's say, like the GDPR wasn't in effect, Human Rights Act. And some other bits. Joining the ABI for guidance, as it was, as the sort of professional body that would cater for private sector investigators, and then learning physically on the job. Where was there a transition from that to then launching, being involved more in a more official capacity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the connections I made at ABI were fantastic. There was from having a book of people and experts and looking in by county. I got to know people, and I got to know the people I could trust, and the people, and also most people in the industry, are happy to guide people. There isn't really a sort of a lot of competition between people. I found people, on the contrary, were very, very helpful towards new people in the business, and I have made some great friends and lifelong friends through the ABI, because we are all of the same. At the end of the day, we've all got that passion for. I keep using the word passion, but it is. We've all got that spirit in us that wants to help a client get to the bottom of a case. And if you haven't got that sort of tenacity, you can't do this job. And you're the same. I know John's the same. You need all that. but I certainly that the personal injury thing, the personal injury boom was really something that really it gave me the opportunity to go and do that. So and to be honest, I loved it. I was in the field myself at the start, doing early doors, getting up at 4 and driving to South Wales, to Glasgow, whatever it was. I've done the hard lines, back of a van for hours. I've done all that, nothing. You come home with a real passion in your heart when you've got a film and you've come all that way, and it's worth all the effort to get what you need to do. And it's interesting. People often say to me, "Oh, how often did you catch people out?" I said, "Well, do you know what? When I think about it, it was most of the time." And that wasn't really because I was anything special. It's just that the cases that we were given had been filtered through medical experts who said,
right,
this guy, inappropriate signs, I suggest you have him watched. And it was on the back of that the insurers felt comfortable to get the job done. But you're right, the privacy laws really have impacted on us. They were there then, but it's much more important now. And that's really where I got into the anorak stage of learning about GDPR, because when I saw that coming, and there were a lot of misunderstandings about what you can do. You'd have to get permission to film somebody, and these people genuinely thought that was going to be the case at the time. It was really, and so I thought that having built this great little business, I didn't want legislation to take all the potency out of it. So again, through the ABI, I met with experts who had got their head around GDPR, and I decided to do so myself, because I wanted that surely there wouldn't be laws out there that would stop an insurance company from protecting itself from a basic, a fraudulent claim. So that's when I got my head around GDPR, which was just really before I met you, wasn't it? Really. And I know. Then I went on then to do some talks about it. You threw me in at the deep end in New York. I remember that. To talk to the New York Association of Private Investigators. All these guys turned up in leather jackets, carrying guns, wanting to listen to an ex-shopkeeper from Salford. That was pretty brave of you at the time, really.
That was good. But
yeah, it was good fun, that, and I did feel better that, and I think also, I think we agree, Mike. What you had to do at those times was put your clients in a comfortable position and let them know that we know what we can do. But very often we had to educate even lawyers about what we can and can't do. It's surprising, really. So so humbly we said, look, we can do this, and we had to sort of instill that confidence in the clients to allow us to do what we were planning to do. And privacy really has kicked in. But thankfully, and speaking generally, I'm really, really pleased that we can still do this, because when privacy impacts all the time, and and the rights of individuals against the rights to protect yourselves. History has been kind to us so far and allows us to do that. And I do sort of count my blessings that we can still do it, because it's the sort of thing that somebody could say, no, this is too invasive or whatever. But thankfully, we've weaved a path through it and been able to work with the regulations to do what we do, and even to this day. And I would say, getting passionate now, but it is still one of the most underutilized tools out there in the law. People don't realise, just how fantastic surveillance can be in all sorts of life, in all sorts of cases, and it's still massively underused, particularly in things like employment. Absence and that sort of stuff. Although we've had some great fun in that.
Agreed. So Roger Bescoby goes global. Talk to me a little bit about your journey, where the man from Salford now attacks the global stage.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was when, I came, I tried retirement. It lasted about 3 weeks.
That's right.
My wife put a sign up in the kitchen that said "Retirement is twice the husband for half the money," and I sort of, yeah, okay, that's probably about right. I knew you and John from ABI meetings and what have you, and I saw I've got nearly 20 years on you, but I saw in you where I was in relation to building a business, and having the passion to do. You came from a surveyor's background like I did, and so it was a case of, well, why don't we see what we can do? And I've got a lot of clients here that I can bring along. And to be fair, from coming, my business was parochial compared to Conflict. Really, it was UK based and mainly north of England. If I'm really honest, and so I had clients and good relationships with law firms that I knew I could go along and say, look, hey, now with these guys, I'm pretty sure we can handle overseas stuff. We can handle serious asset location jobs, that sort of, which I could never really. That wasn't my expertise at all. So really, it worked really well in that I could, and because I think, to be fair, I had still have a decent and a trusted name in the industry, and people came along and gave Roger, whilst at Conflicts, a chance to see what we can do. And I think we've built some great clients, and then within a year you taught me into the WAD and introduced me to that, and that's been amazing. I mean, like you say, from throwing me in at New York, and I was in Madrid. I've been all over the world with you since then, and it's been amazing. But it's funny that the Salford logic, as I call it, that I sort of learned on the street. It's borne me well, really. I still apply those basic principles, and guile and experience, and it's great. I mean, I am probably about the oldest person in the company. I think I feel like I'm the most immature, but I'm probably the oldest person in the company, and it's nice to sort of work with younger people and be able to relay the expertise. Because I think as you get older in this business, there are less things that come across your desk that you haven't seen before.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so it's great to be able to mentor some of the younger people that we've had join the business. We were all, but the WAD thing made friends all over the world through that, and through Conflict. Obviously, you've held positions there. I really can't believe that I'm now second vice president of the WAD. I really can't. I mean, 2 years' time, I'll be president of the oldest association in the world, and I can't believe that. And I'm sure a lot of my fellow members will probably feel the same. But yeah, it's a huge honour, and just to sort of the characters in that association are amazing. But from a business perspective, it just what's the main thing? Well, it allows you to say yes. Can you help me in Brazil? Yes. Can you help me in China? Yes. Wherever you want to talk about, there'll be somebody there, a trusted person, and these are people that, not just names you pull out of a directory, but people that we meet and that we have beers with and we go to conferences with. And it's a very, very special mix of people, and it's totally apolitical. We have people who are fighting wars on paper, but they're the best mates in the WAD. It's fascinating as an association, and say 102 years now, is it, since it's been going? Incredible. And yeah, I'm very, very proud. I say I was involved in it at a VP level for the centenary in Chicago last year.
How was that experience for you, being up there on the chair, global stage, the first time an international association has reached 100 years, a global association has reached 100 years.
Yeah.
And, all eyes on WAD. You're up on the stand. There's 300 odd members there in attendance, and how was that? Talk through that experience, Rod.
Well, I think I it was daunting, and because there are a lot of very, very successful people there from all over. I mean, the WAD is not inexpensive to be involved in. There's a lot of travel. There's but what it does, it means that there are no pretenders there. Everybody that's there is a serious player in their field, in their country, and in their town. And well, listen, I've never done it before, but I think I sort of held my own. I tend to sort of revert to a bit of humour wherever I can when I get on the stage, really, to lighten things up, because it's the way I get across to people. And I never have been particularly an academic, but I've got a passion for the industry, and I can relay that. But yeah, it's I look at some of the pictures now where I've got this massive room full of people in Chicago and this Salford shopkeepers on the platform. I don't quite know how it happened, but people are lovely, and I still feel that I've got something to offer. And as I say, going back to the streets of Salford, that experience is I still use ideas and that I learned then and apply those to investigations to this day. Although I don't have much hands-on involvement, I'm more doing business development and client relations these days. But I know the industry, and I can talk about it with a passion, because I have still got that passion. And as long as I have, hopefully you'll put up with me for as long as you can. No, it's. And then the other thing is that I don't know whether Mike. I became the inspiration for a TV star. Did you hear about this one?
No, go on.
Well, so back in 2005, I got a phone call from a solicitor pal who said, "Look, my brother-in-law's a scriptwriter."
Right.
He said, and he's got this idea of a drama of a private investigator. And he's looking for some ideas of stories and one thing and another. And because this solicitor was a really good pal of mine, I said, well, look, yeah, you can send him down. We can't give him any names or anything, but we'll talk through some of the things that we've done and some of the funny ones and some of the audacious ones and things like that.
Yeah.
So this guy came to see me, and he's a very, very affable Liverpudlian called Stephen Butchard, who, if you Google him, he's become a very famous scriptwriter now for TV stuff. Okay. And he came into the office, and I said, well, what's your idea? He said, well, I've got an idea for this PI, and he's called Vincent. So I said, right, that was my father's name. So you're on a winner here already. Carry on. So he said, well, this guy, he's a struggling private investigator. He's got from the north of England. He's got a wife with an insatiable spending habit and 2 delinquent kids. And I'm going, Stephen, you've come to the right man. You've landed on your feet. And joking apart, we gave him a few stories, and he went away. And that series was launched in 2005-06. Ray Winston played the part. Saran Jones was his sidekick, and they did 2 series of it.
Brilliant.
And it was totally influenced by, and some of the case, if you watch that, some of those stories are loosely based on real things that happened.
Real things, but just changed. Yeah.
Yeah, changing the names and the locations and stuff. But the basis of the story was just was one of those things, including me following somebody to a foreign capital and on a matrimonial. And we caught the wife, I'm afraid, and I'm talking to the client saying, I'm really sorry, but this isn't good news. And he said, give her the phone.
Give her.
Anyway, rightly or wrongly, I did, and but yeah, so those sort of things you couldn't write those sort of things. But all part of life's rich tapestry, I suppose.
Yeah. What would you say, given the changes that you've seen in the industry, are the biggest challenges now for young guys coming in? Young guys because there's been a seismic shift with the individuals that are coming into the industry. I think we're both quite rare breeds, not from police or military backgrounds, where most of the industry is made up of that. But I've seen that change generation over generation. What do you see as the biggest challenge for the young guys coming into this market?
Well, I think there's no doubt we can learn a lot from young guys who are just far more tech savvy than we will ever be. They grow up with the internet and the webs and one thing and another. I think for me it's finding the people with the appetite and the patience to do the job. I think really, you can't. I mean, surveillance, for instance, it can seem to be very exciting, but when it comes to it, and you're sat in the back of the van for hours and nothing's happening, and then you lose the guy in the first 3 minutes, it can be soul destroying. So it takes a certain sort of person to be able to do that. I think one of my frustrations I'm not really answering your question here very well. One of my frustrations to this day remains the lack of collaboration between law enforcement and our industry. And I think that if we were able to take up the slack the police, struggle to keep on top of, the caseloads and what have you. That's an area, and I think that if we were allowed to do that, we'd probably get more people coming into the industry, because there's so much more you can do. We still very much we know there are so many things that we can do as a private investigation profession, that if only we were given the headway to do that. I think going back to your question about young people coming in, it's finding companies that can afford to take that, that risk on. I mean, we all know how the government's made it more expensive to employ people.
Yeah.
And that is, whether you like it or not, that's across all industry. It really is. But I think that there are a lot of people who they strive to go to university and to get the degrees and what have you, one thing or another. But I would say there are, if my kids were growing up again, I'd be saying do something that AI can't do.
Yep.
Because that's where you will always survive and make a living and feed yourself, I think.
Yeah. Okay. You answered a question with 3 or 4 other questions, but the one I want to touch back on is the private-public synergy, actually, Roger, because we work different jurisdictions, and I've seen the way the US market work in that area. Do you think the UK could benefit from that, or given your experience now working in different jurisdictions, how sort of the law enforcement and us in terms of cross collaboration?
I mean, hugely. I mean, you speak to anybody, who hasn't got a frustration about trying to get the police interested in the theft of a bike or a car or a break-in or whatever it might be, an assault. And fraud, it's still today the number one reported crime in the UK is fraud. It's above all the others, and yet you police won't take that report off you. It has to go to. Well, I've got strong opinions on that. Fraud is a very hard thing to crack, and if those police forces took those cases on, there'd be lots and lots of cases that they weren't able to solve. Because they haven't got the time or the manpower, but it goes against their figures of unsolved crimes, and it would look bad on the figures. That's my own personal opinion, controversial, but I can't think of any other reason. Which is why it goes into something like action fraud, where you're very, very lucky if it ever gets looked at. And that's the reality of it. That's where the frustration is, because of all those cases there, if they were filtered out into our industry, they would get action by people, a lot of whom are former fraud investigators, police officers, seasoned investigators and detectives. We could make a big inroad into that, but it just doesn't happen. And it's very, very frustrating.
Could it be resources though, Roger, as well? Could it be resources and other, let's say, more serious crimes?
Listen, I'm not criticising the police. They've got to apply these things to things like terrorism and murders and child abuse, all this sort of stuff, and that's got to come first. I get that. And fraud has always seemed to be a victimless crime or whatnot, although it isn't. But no, I'm just saying that there is an answer out there. There are people with all the intelligence and the ability to make a big inroad into the stuff that law enforcement can't do. And like you say, in America, they work together. There's synergy there. Over here, it's just a one-way street. And it's very, very frustrating. They'll take all the intelligence you want, given, but trying to get anything back. And to be fair, they're not allowed to. They'll be on a hiding to nothing if an officer gives something that he shouldn't. He's out of a job, and I get that. But there's just a huge opportunity being missed, and that also goes down to things like going back to surveillance. Going back to things like absence in certain public sector roles, public sector industries. Where absence is in certain areas is out of control, and in certain areas, and I'm so sure that we can make huge inroads into that if only they would let private sector get involved. Benefits, fraud, that sort of stuff. There's very, very little of that work that filters down to the private sector. That, of course, is directly related to the lack of licensing in the UK still, and until we get that, and we're talking about licensing coming next year. When I first came into the business nearly 40 years ago, and we're still there, and despite fantastic efforts by the ABI, Tony Amossi, people like that, and yourself, to try and it's so frustrating. But so but what do? We self-regulate as best we can with with various accreditations that we can get, which cost money and take a lot of time, and hopefully that gets recognised. But it is still my frustration, that we can't get stuck into some of the collaboration thing is something that is really, and whenever I go to a meeting, if I go to a fraud conference or whatever, I'm always, and there's people there from the police or whatever, or from the government, I'm saying, look, pass the stuff this way. You've got a whole army of people here who could really, really help you. But will it happen without licensing? Probably not.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. The intention's there, the skill sets are there. There's definitely support there. It's just how do you put all those pieces together so it works efficiently without being manipulated in any way? It's a tough one. I hope we'll get there one day, Rod. Probably not in my career, your career, but
it would be nice, wouldn't it? I mean, I think at the end of the day, you've got to have a passion for this business, and the people that I work with and the people that I mix with this industry have all got that. There's something, we share a common goal of wanting to do what's right for a client.
100%. I'm going to finish up on this one question, Roger. Give me the biggest career highlight that you've encountered and achieved today.
Well, I think a couple of things. I've been quite proud of being brave enough to change the direction of my business right from the word go, from being a Grace Brothers, going through to debt collection. I had a spell in lending, I had a spell in pawnbroking, that sort of thing. And I'm quite proud of being brave enough to try different things when the other things aren't working. And earlier, I'm quite proud of that. But no, listen, you know the answer. Nothing makes me more proud than to be vice president of the WAD. I mean, I could not believe, I must have put my hand up at the wrong time or something. I don't know what happened, but no. But seriously, I got that vote to be made third VP, and it didn't sink in for a few weeks. But yeah, it's nice, and the recognition that it gives, and there's a responsibility with it as well, which I enjoy, and it's recognised, and the people who work in that association, there's some incredible intellect and characters, and I'm just very, very proud, and I still can't believe I'm going to be president in 2 years. I can't, but somebody will take a picture and prove it was me. I don't know. Yeah, there we go.
You thoroughly deserve, Rog. The board unanimously voted you in, so there's no issue there. I'm sure you'll do a fantastic job. Roger, pleasure speaking to you. Roger Bescoby's details coming up on the screen now if anyone wants to reach out to Roger direct. Thank you very much. You've been listening to another episode of Leaders Podcast.